Most people, when you ask them who is the hardest person they've ever had to forgive, have a face in mind immediately. A parent, an ex, the friend who disappeared at exactly the wrong moment, the person who said something that landed somewhere it shouldn't have been allowed to reach. There's usually a face, or a name, or a specific afternoon that still has edges. What I noticed after years of sitting with people near the end of their lives is that the face they were still carrying, the unforgiven one, wasn't always the one they named first. It was quieter than that, and older. And when it finally surfaced, it was usually their own. Not in the way people mean when they say, "You have to forgive yourself," as a piece of wellness advice. Not the self they are now, the self that can reflect and understand and choose differently. Something more specific, more cornered. The version of themselves that did what they did, who stayed when they should have gone, who left when they should have stayed, who said the thing that couldn't be unsaid, who made the choice that rerouted everything. Not from cruelty, but from fear, or confusion, or desperation, or the particular blindness that belongs to a person who hasn't yet become who they're going to be. That version. The one caught in the wrong moment with the wrong equipment. Jung was precise about why this particular form of forgiveness is the hardest, not in a therapeutic or inspirational sense, in a structural one. In the 11th volume of his collected works, an essay called Psychotherapists or Clergy, written in 1932, he posed what he considered the essential psychological question. He asked what would happen if a person discovered that the worst they had ever encountered in others, the most impudent, the most guilty, the most irredeemable, was also present in themselves. That the enemy was not outside, that they themselves were the enemy who must be loved. He wrote, "What if I should discover that the least amongst them all, the poorest of all beggars, the most impudent of all offenders, that these are within me, and that I myself stand in need of the alms of my own kindness." Alms. The word he chose was alms. The charity you give to someone who cannot repay you, not because they've earned it, because they need it. He said that accepting this, fully without flinching, was the essence of the moral problem and the acid test of one's whole outlook on life. Not the hardest thing you'll do for other people, the hardest thing you'll do, period. And the reason it's harder isn't sentimental, it's structural. When you forgive someone else, there's an implicit frame that allows it. You had a self, separate from them. They made a choice. That choice had consequences. You can, with time and effort, and sometimes years, extend something toward them across the distance. When you turn that same movement toward a version of yourself, the distance collapses. There's no one to extend it toward, and no one to receive it, because the judge and the defendant occupy the same body. And what I watched, over and over in hospice work, is that the internal judge applies a standard to the internal defendant that would be considered cruel if it were applied to anyone else. The person who stayed in the wrong situation for 7 years because they were afraid. They would tell you with genuine compassion that a friend who had done the same thing was acting out of fear, not stupidity. That fear doesn't make someone weak. That they did what they could with what they had. And then they'd apply none of that to themselves. The person who said the thing, the word, the sentence, the cruelty that arrived at precisely the wrong moment and left a mark, they would understand, for someone else, that people say things under pressure that don't represent who they are. That words spoken at the edge of what someone can carry aren't the whole of who they are. And then they'd spend decades treating their own version of that as verdict rather than moment. There was a woman I sat with in my last years of hospice work. She'd left her marriage. Finally left it, after years that had cost her things she rarely spoke about directly. And she'd taken her daughters with her. The leaving had been the right thing. There was no other word for it. But what she was still carrying, 20 years later, wasn't the marriage. It was the woman who had stayed inside it so long. She couldn't reconcile herself with that version. The one who had seen what was happening and calculated year after year that staying was safer. Who had taught her daughters by presence and example, that you absorb what happens to you. Who had known something was wrong and stayed anyway? She wasn't angry at the version of herself that had finally left. She had forgiven that one easily. The one who escaped, who chose differently, who made the break. It was the version that had stayed she couldn't reach. I asked her one afternoon what she would say to her daughter if her daughter had been in that same situation, had stayed in it for the same reasons. She was quiet for a long time. Then she said, I'd tell her she was scared. I'd tell her she was doing the only thing she could figure out how to do. I said, that's true of you too. She said, I know, but it doesn't feel the same. That gap between what we'd offer someone else and what we allow ourselves is exactly what Jung was pointing at. He spent a period of his own life, roughly 1913 to 1918, following the collapse of his relationship with Freud, doing what he later called the confrontation with the unconscious. He went inward deliberately, into the material that frightened him most, including the parts of himself he hadn't handled well, the intellectual arrogance, the ways he had used proximity to Freud, and then the separation from Freud in ways he wasn't proud of. The father-figure dynamics he had played out and then disclaimed. What emerged from that period was the Red Book, the document of his self-encounter. What he found, working through that material, wasn't that the dark parts of himself had been dissolved or corrected or made acceptable. It was that they needed to be met. Not punished, not suppressed, not explained away. Met with something he was willing to call kindness. The version of you that made the wrong call. The one living in whatever year, under whatever pressure, with whatever limited view of things, didn't have access to who you are now. Didn't have the understanding you've spent the years since then accumulating. That version operated from what it had. Fear was a tool it used because it was the tool available. Avoidance was a strategy because the alternatives hadn't been discovered yet. The blindness wasn't chosen. The internal tribunal doesn't account for any of this. It issues its verdict from the future, retroactively, using evidence that wasn't available in the original moment. It convicts based on what you know now about what you should have known then. That's not justice. Jung would have recognized it immediately as something else. The shadow turned inward. The capacity for moral judgment weaponized against the self rather than used in service of self-knowledge. Severity without mercy. A court with no defense. The hardest person to forgive isn't the one who hurt you most. It's the one who was you. In the worst moment you've had, when you were working with less than you needed and more than you could carry, that person wasn't separate from you. They were the version of you that existed before you knew better, before you had the tools, before you had the distance to see clearly what was happening. They were doing, imperfectly and with consequences, what they could figure out how to do. Jung's word for it, alms, suggests something important. Alms don't require the recipient to have earned them. They don't require demonstrated remorse or visible improvement or sufficient time served. They're offered because someone is in need. That version of you is still waiting for them. The trial has been running long enough. It doesn't need a verdict. It needs to end.